Hi, how you doing? Hey everyone, grab a seat. Awesome. Fantastic. First off, I wanted to thank everybody for braving the snow, the sleet, and the ice to come out. It's amazing. I want to thank Daniel Spectrum for sure, because this is an amazing venue, and the next one we're going to have it packed to the rims. And I want to definitely thank NORML Cannabis for helping us out with this amazing event. There's actually, like Oprah here, we have toques on every chair. Woo! Awesome, grab a toque, Cannabis Amnesty, CFAMM, and of course NORML. Okay, anyways. So NORML Canada and I have a lot of things in common. We were born the same year. We pride our fight for personal liberty. And when I was asked to take on the role of executive chair, I could not say no. In 2018, NORML celebrated 40 years of Canada, well, being in Canada. NORML has always operated on the mandate of reforming marijuana laws, and reform we did. Supporting constitutional and court challenges, working with government while mobilizing public support. We supported Supreme Court challenges to create new medical marijuana laws in Canada, and US NORML challenged American voting ballots and won cannabis rights state after state after state. But the biggest win of all was the federal legalization of cannabis in Canada. NORML Canada now had to rethink its mandate when I came on. We were like, what are we gonna do now? Be legalized. So we had to come up with a new mandate. And now we have to shift cannabis laws, and we have to work to create functional cannabis laws for every Canadian, whether you're a consumer or whether you're in the industry or you're a politician or you're just a member of the public who doesn't really care about cannabis, but you care that your neighbor consumes in their home, right? The purpose of legalization is to transition everyone into growing, selling, consuming cannabis legally. Creating laws that will accomplish this goal is the new normal. Same mandate of reforming marijuana laws, but now we reform cannabis laws for the successful future to showcase to the world. Again, thank you for braving the elements tonight, and give a round of applause to our panel. There you go.
Check. Hi everybody, Anin, Magese Beboyad Nadijnakas, Takanik Nadojaba, Shagi Nadodem. Good evening everybody, my name is Ian Compo, also known as DJ NDN, formerly of a tribe called Red. Also a host of a podcast with my dear friend Sarah Hanlon here. We together discuss a lot of different cannabis topics with a lot of people involved in the industry.
Yes, we do.
Oh. Check.
Hello? Oh, there. Yeah, the levels are going to be down on this girl here, yeah. Yes, we do. We were just telling Nate here, we have actually got in trouble twice.
Sworn at.
In 2 different cities for being too loud in a public space.
In a restaurant. 2 different restaurants. One was a bar even, that was the worst.
It was a witch bar, even, yeah. Have you ever been to a witch bar and caused a scene? We have. But seriously, thank you all for being here out in that wicked, wink wink weather. It means the world to us.
Yeah, my background in cannabis has been helping me not want to hurt myself. It's a major thing with my social anxieties, my depression, and it helped my wife get through cancer, and it still is one of her daily cancer medications. And Sarah...
I just smoke weed. I'm kidding. I love cannabis. I think that cannabis law reform is a social justice issue, as I'm sure many of us here agree. And in terms of an event like this, I think it's really important that we talk about these things openly and think them out. And thank you, Nate, for being here. It's really cool to have someone who we can have a government representative to talk your ear off today, and most importantly is questions. So we want everyone to feel really comfortable asking anything you want. We're going to do a little one-on-one, but then I'm going to sit right there in the audience with this mic for any audience questions. So when the time comes, after a little one-on-one, we're going to throw to you guys, and please, I'm going to say the cliche line, there are no stupid questions. Don't feel silly about asking anything. I've been in the industry for like 5 years now. The industry, I hate that word. But, you know, I've been working around cannabis for a long time now, and I still have questions every day. So nothing's off limits. Please feel comfortable and safe in doing that. And if you need anything, let us know.
So the way this is going to work is going to be divvied up into 2 different kind of discussions. First, we're going to be speaking with our MP here, Nathaniel Smith, one-on-one, and any sort of, we're going to have a few questions, and again, any questions from the crowd, and then after, we're going to open it up to the panel, and we're going to introduce everybody on the panel after we do the one-on-one. You guys ready for this? Ready to talk cannabis? All right. So we have Nathaniel Smith, a Liberal MP from Beaches, East York. He is the Vice Chair of Access to Information, Privacy and Ethics Committee. He also sits on the Executive Committee of the Canadian Group of Interparliamentary Union as past president. In his role as president, he has represented Canada at parliamentary conferences around the world. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, really stoked that you're here, man. So we have a few questions that we kind of came up with in a phone call. One of the major things post legalization, obviously, like one of the major roadblocks that we see seems to be the supply and demand, right? How do we deal with the supply and demand issue, both in recreational, but also with medical? Like it's messing up a lot of the medical issues.
So, one thing is, and I'm not the health minister, but I know the health minister has put more resources, and rightfully so, more resources into processing applications so that we add more legal supply. I think everyone knew that the government that all levels of government weren't going to be ready, and sure enough.
I think we all knew that, right? Like
everyone knew, yeah, I knew, yeah. And so it's sure enough, all levels of government were not prepared for the demand. And now that they're, rightfully playing catch up, and I think at the very least more resources for Health Canada. I think at the provincial level, and different provinces have adopted different systems that will allow them to move faster or slower depending upon their system. But certainly when we look at Ontario, they have slowed everything down. They need to ramp up efforts to make sure that there is the ability for people to purchase.
How does that work with medical now? Like on the same, the access to medical seems to be hurting.
Yeah, so I don't know the answer to this question. If someone has an answer, and Jonathan might, or someone on the panel here might, and if you do have an answer, I would like to hear it so I can help advocate for pushing that answer forward, because as companies see the ability to profit from the rec market, and that's where the money goes, that's where the investment goes, and we obviously saw, Canada was the first jurisdiction to legalize medicinal cannabis. The courts really forced scared politicians really from doing the right thing, and that's great. And so there was a market that was, more restricted than it ought to have been, but at least growing. And the rec market has eaten that up, and it's to a significant degree. So I think if you've got answers, let me know, because I have not turned my mind completely to that question, but we obviously want to put patients, I think, first as much as possible. So,
Do you smoke cannabis?
I do.
Perfect. That's important. I find that's really important to like bring up with anybody, especially people like making policy on cannabis, to see if they partake or not.
I was at. It's funny. I don't get scrummed very often. Believe it or not, I'm not a minister, and so it's rare for being scrummed. Means all the cameras come and start asking you questions, and it's happened on a few occasions. But the most recent was the day of legalization, and I've been vocal about cannabis legalization previously, certainly more vocal than a lot of my colleagues, and so they see me walking out of the house and all the cameras come over and I get the question, oh, will you consume cannabis now that it's legal? And I said, it would be pretty silly for me to stop now, wouldn't it? And so I think it's a question that I don't think all politicians will answer truthfully today, even though it's legal, but I bet if you ask politicians 5 years from now, people will be a lot more truthful about it because people won't really give a shit, I don't think.
Yeah, agreed. As it becomes more normal, right? As people start normalizing it, this is what needs to happen. I feel like more people like you need to come out and say like, yeah, I smoke cannabis, I consume. So on another question, how do we ensure that the illicit market can easily transition into the legal market?
So there are a number of different aspects to that question. One is, I think it's a matter of making sure where there are applicants that have expertise, making sure that we're facilitating that as much as possible so they can hit the ground running. It adds to the supply, but also addresses people who have been part of the illicit supply, making sure that that transition happens as effectively as possible. The more difficult question, not for me, because I think where people have been nonviolent offenders, I don't think it should be, people should be precluded from accessing the legal cannabis regime, but I know there are a lot of different views in government, and that I think the prevailing view would be where people have criminal records, then they're precluded from participating. And so that is, if you're talking about reforms going forward, when we look at other jurisdictions that have recognized the historical injustice and said, actually, we want to make sure that people are included as much as possible to rectify that injustice. That's not the approach that we've currently taken. So one of the ways that I would encourage NORML to pursue advocacy going forward is to highlight that as an issue and to ensure that people who are nonviolent with respect to their records previously, and certainly where their records relate to cannabis specifically, as we have legalized and recognized that that's it was an unjust policy previously and one that we were aiming to correct going forward. Part of correcting that injustice would be ensuring that those people can participate in the legal regime.
How would you ensure that? Like, would you make it so that a certain amount of people get hired by LPs?
At a minimum, I would say it's less ambitious than that. At a minimum, it's not excluding people, which right now the rules do.
Right. Does the government have any plans to entice this at all, like to encourage people who were in the illicit market to cross over?
Only insofar as if they remain in the illicit market, then they won't be able to continue doing what they're doing there's an opportunity to participate in a legal supply, which is going to crowd out the illegal supply over time. And obviously, with supply and demand issues, it's not going to do that right away. But over time, we don't see too many beer bootleggers, and for the same reason, I think over time, we're not going to see too many people continue to participate in the illegal growing market, as it were. So I think making sure that people can apply, making sure the application process is speedy, making sure that we're facilitating people, we're not precluding people from accessing the regime. Beyond that, I don't think there is going to be an active outreach to say, put up your hand if you've grown pot in the past and come on over and participate.
Is there any questions about this? About the illicit crossover?
Here, let me come at you.
I'm sorry for the booing thing. It's just that we don't have a weight. We never have a voice.
That's okay, you can boo, that's fine. It's not the first time.
So, illicit, I mean, people have only been illicit because they've been legislated.
Can you hold up just a second?
Oh, sorry. People are only, or they call the market illicit only because people have been legislated out of it. It's not because it's illicit. It's been 97 years or whatever, and we now know that marijuana isn't what they said it was. And they can't even still associate the thing that's wrong with marijuana, why for 97 years it's been illicit. And so all those people that have said for 97 years, hey, this product has great potential for great things. And okay, so over the last 10 years, people are like, yeah, maybe this is true. Maybe there's been a problem. So then if they can establish that there was a problem, why would the government still go on the previous assumption that it's some wicked drug or some violent causing war mongering type of effect?
So I don't think that the government has gone as far in a number of respects as I would like them to. But when I say the illicit market today, I mean those who are not authorized producers. And so the government's view of this has been, we are going to legalize, but there's going to be strict regulations in terms of who is going to be an authorized producer and who is going to be an authorized seller. And so the illicit market today is not, this is a wrongful thing and it's the war on drugs, as it were. It's to say, in the same way we have other regulated substances, in the same way we have a regulated gambling regime, in the same way we regulate most things, if you operate outside of that regulated system, then you're operating illicitly. So I think the question is, how do we make sure people who have been illicit growers, say, can enter into the legal system? I would say, well, of course they can, and the problem is only they're precluded under the existing rules if they have been caught previously. And so that is something that I think efforts should be made to rectify. But beyond that, I don't know how we go over and above and say, if you've grown pot in the past, how do we make sure you get facilitated faster into the system? I don't think there's an easy answer to that.
We've been waiting for 4 years since Mr. Trudeau became Prime Minister, and we haven't given us any licenses. The only thing we've come with just now is, let's have a dice toss and see who gets to do it. We've been waiting 5 years for licenses.
So the dice toss was with respect to the provincial government and sellers. With respect to growers, and I'm not justifying delays in the system, and that was my answer to the first question, which is resources. They've recognized, Health Canada has recognized that things need to move faster, and they have recently, and people may know more about this than I do, but I understand they have recently put more resources in the system to process authorizations faster and licenses faster.
One more follow-up. A normal person can't wait 10 years. Like, I have a family, people that have been in the market, you can't wait 10 years for you to get it right. The fact is that what they're calling a drug isn't what they said it was, and they need to be approaching it from a very, very different point of view.
It's not the same as gambling and alcohol and tobacco. We don't consent that as a fact. They're in a different category. This is a healing herb.
So
no one has a right to unlawfully persecute somebody.
So okay, so we'll likely not agree on this statement, and you're welcome to boo, it's okay. But let me say this, I've been a recreational cannabis user for a long time. I'm sure I don't smoke as much as Sarah does,
Definitely not.
You don't.
And I have Crohn's, so I don't have a license, as it were, but I've used it medicinally for a very long time too, when I have stomach pains, when I have nausea, when I need to stimulate my appetite. So I respect it as a medicinal substance as well, and I've read the cases, and there's a lot of evidence to that end. The most recent literature review from the Academy of Sciences in the US suggests there's great medicinal benefits for things just like that, people going through cancer, for chronic pain relief. But that same literature review also does identify potential harms for pregnant women, for people driving, obviously, and for adolescents. And so if we're committed to evidence-based drug policy, which I hope we are, and I would say, quite apart from cannabis, evidence-based drug policy means we have to regulate all drugs according to their respective harms. But if we're committed to that evidence-based approach, we have to also recognize there are potential harms to this substance and that it should be regulated, and it shouldn't be, I don't think it should be a straight up free-for-all. You can grow and sell to anyone, and there shouldn't be rules in place. And so, yes, things may go more slowly than people would like, but we're also the first developed country to legalize cannabis as far as it goes. Other states certainly are moving beyond us already, but we're still in the infancy of legalization around the world. And so I think there are growing pains, no question, but I think we've come a very long way in a very short time, given the decades and century of injustice that we've seen in the past.
I think the next question actually kind of deals with this. How does the government intend on working with provinces and municipalities to level out the mess of patchwork of the regulations? I have a good follow-up too.
So there's been a lot of work to ensure that provinces have jurisdiction to implement the sales regime, that they were given a lot of time and runway to get this right. The only reason Ontario is as fucked up as it is right now is because changing government, and so one approach turned into another approach, and they had to really start from scratch in a serious way. But other jurisdictions provincially have not had this problem. And in terms of municipalities, I don't think have necessarily fully appreciated the role that they have to play. And maybe it's the fault of the feds, maybe it's the fault of the provinces, I don't know. But certainly when you look at jurisdictions like Oregon as one example, there's been a lot of experience there about the neighbor disputes that occur, and really we're talking about bylaws that need to be put in place municipally to ensure that neighbors aren't pissing each other off over not just noises, which we have noise bylaws, but smell. And the more you have rules in place at the outset, the more you avoid people annoyed at, frustrated with, angry at legalization. So I think we could have probably done a better job of laying out some of the experiences from other jurisdictions to ensure municipalities were ready to hit the ground running. And the only other thing I would say is on the tax side, and I'm happy to have a conversation about how we should change taxes. I've got the button too, and I think I took a picture with the button. And I agree with the fight to not levy an excise tax on medical cannabis, but sharing tax proceeds with other levels of government has been a priority as well.
Follow-up question. Where do Indigenous jurisdiction fall into all of this?
I don't. Sometimes politicians just make up answers. I don't really know the answer to that, so I'm just going to say I don't really know. Happy to figure that out. I do think. I know I've got colleagues, so I sit next to an MP from Belleville, who there is a growing operation on a reserve in his community. Sales occur there too. I don't know how legal that is as far as it goes, but I think when you look at, I think it was Vice that published research from jurisdictions across Canada where, and this is just with respect to simple possession, so I don't know the disproportionate impact for other offenses with respect to cannabis, but when you look at simple possession offenses, they've disproportionately impacted Black and Indigenous communities. So I think without question, if you're looking at it as a historical injustice, and I agree that it is, then to correct that injustice, you need to facilitate access for those communities, I think, where they want to participate as much as possible.
So the jurisdiction is on them as federal land, because it was just legalized federally and it was given to the provinces to figure it out. Indigenous land is federal land, it's not.
Yeah, so I don't know the answer to that. I know growing is obviously regulated federally and distribution is regulated provincially. So I don't know how the unique jurisdiction.
We'll talk after, because there's a constitution thing also in understanding the treaty process
and there's obviously also, I do know, and I mentioned gambling earlier, but I do know some Indigenous jurisdictions have not operated within the law at all times, and then the feds go, we don't want that problem, and they don't bother them. So I know Poker Stars was hosted for a long time, if it isn't still, on the Kanawake Reserve.
Yeah, hold on. All right, one last question for you, sir, just you by yourself. So constantly as legalization was approaching, I found especially the Liberals kept bringing up we want to keep this out of the hands of criminals, we want to keep this out of the hands of criminals over and over and over. And then we find out that a lot of gangs, organized bike gangs and whatnot are investing in high up. So how do we stop organized crime from investing in the market?
So this gets at a little bit of a previous question where you say there are people operating in the illicit market, and how do we ensure that they have access to the illicit market? So I would say where individuals have violent records, where they obviously are involved in activities that have been criminal rightfully criminal, and unrelated to cannabis, I think there are good reasons to ensure that they're not investing in the legal cannabis marketplace. But I don't know how we draw those clear lines to, like, if someone has not been convicted of an offense, if someone has an association to a biker gang, that there's a lawful component to it. I think
There's a constitutional, like, you're allowed freedom of association.
yeah, so
there's a
exactly.
lot
So
of-
I don't think there's an easy way to draw those lines, and if you draw those lines too strictly, then you're actually carving out some of the people that you're going to want to participate in the space. So I don't know the answer to that, but it's a tricky, I think, thing to exclude, where people are investing through lawful means, and maybe the money is ill-gotten in some way. So unless we're able to trace that, it's a difficult thing to do. But I wouldn't want a biker gang that has gotten its proceeds through illegal activities unrelated to cannabis that are rightfully illegal, to then be using those monies to invest in legal cannabis.
All right. Any questions for Nathaniel?
Well, awesome. Thank you, guys. Start over here. I was going to jump on that question with my own, but since we have audience questions, we'll prioritize.
Yeah, hey. So there's a language in the Cannabis Act that really sent up red flags in my mind as a marketer. We decided, for whatever reason, in the Cannabis Act to say that this is a legalized narcotic. And I'm hoping you can explain to me, why is cannabis a legalized narcotic and not just a product? Why do we have to treat cannabis like we have to treat morphine? But gambling can go on the radio and say, fun and excitement at Casino Niagara, come try our ribs. But we can't say, hey, cannabis might be good for you. Come on down to the local legal cannabis store and buy your legal cannabis. So hold on, that's part one. And then part two is, why do we need to approach it as if it's some sketchy, horrible, like you're a patient, you get it. It's a product that helps people. Why can't we approach it like a product that helps people, i.e. Tylenol? Ira Price has a fantastic statement that I like to use, which is, when you look at morphine's benefit list, the number one benefit of morphine is euphoria. The number one negative of THC on Health Canada's website is euphoria. Explain that to me and make it make some sense, because to be frank with you, I love the Liberal government. I love what you guys have done, and I love legal cannabis. So make it make sense to me. I'm your prime target.
Mic drop it.
Yeah, so I don't know, I've got no idea why they refer to it as a narcotic, other than the pre-existing way that they've dealt with it historically. I don't know the answer to that. But with respect to, on the advertising front, I think for the same reason, I think it's, so I'll say this, I've asked this question in the House of my Conservative colleagues, who were railing against legalization. I don't think they will roll it back now, because they realize how unpopular it would be if they were successful in an election. But it's crazy that for all of the harms associated with alcohol, whether it's drunk driving, whether it's domestic abuse, whether it's sexual assaults on campus and otherwise, whether it's fetal alcohol syndrome, there are lots of harms, and yet I get a glossy flyer from the LCBO in my mailbox, and we preclude cannabis from advertising this, cannabis marketers and vendors and producers from marketing the same way. The argument can cut one of two ways, though. It can mean that we should make it more lenient for cannabis marketers, or it alternatively would mean if we take a public health approach seriously across the board, it means we should restrict commercial advertising for alcohol and for gambling and for these other things. And from a consumer perspective, if I were not a politician and concerned about the broader public policy goals, as a consumer, I would say, yeah, advertise to me, sure, I don't care. But when you look at the public policy objectives, if we take a public health approach to drug policy, I actually think you're then end up restricting commercial advertising more strictly, but across the board in a fair way.
But then they'll lobby to have, like, to be able.
Oh, sorry. No, Ian, please. God. No. I don't want to interrupt. You're Ian. I don't want to interrupt you. You're awesome.
Sorry, John.
Okay. No, listen, that's a great answer, but then I flip back at you with the statement of this. There are far more addictive substances out there, far more dangerous substances. I mean, I think you'd agree that the National Transportation Safety Board of the U.S. is probably a great resource for anti-cannabis and automobile use. Yet they came out and said that cannabis use while driving an automobile is absolutely just as safe as driving sober. And this is the American National Transportation Safety Board. They don't have that narrative, right? That's not their goal. Their goal is to allow us to be safe. And if they're saying it's safe to drive kind, then really we need to take a approach regulating the plant that's in line with its risks. Alcohol, gambling, they're addictive.
Yeah, so I will completely, I've written before, I've said before, but all drugs and drugs in the broad sense of the word, all activities generally should be regulated according to their respective harms, and we should take an evidence-based approach to it. You may not, I'm unaware of the statement. Happy, send me the links. Sure, I appreciate it. I mean, the more informed people. I'm not an expert in anything. I wouldn't hold myself out as, but I'm a pretty good advocate, all things considered. So if anyone who is more expert sends me information that I can then use to be an advocate, the better off I am, and I think the better off we all are, all things considered. On the driving piece, when we were debating this, and I was aggressively pushing on the patient side to say other jurisdictions treat people, medicinal users, differently, and we should do the same. And I was flagging concerns with the nanogram limit with respect to patients. I lost that fight. I don't win all my fights. I won the home grow fight, so there you go. But I do think it makes sense from the politician's view who is concerned about managing this in a successful way across the board, not just for those who are willing to attend on a Tuesday night when it's pissing rain and sleet outside to talk cannabis. You realize that things are going to move more slowly than you like, and it's a political reality, unfortunately. And so all the more reason that NORML should continue to have that series of objectives and say, this is sort of an iterative exercise, that we've got the legal framework as it is, and we're going to try and improve upon it over the coming years.
I often, the way I view it is that the cannabis industry becoming legal is really, I think, going to put other industries, make them step up their game, because the people in cannabis have had so much thrown at them that they're being forced to live up to, in my opinion, a standard that isn't fair at all. But in that way, the silver lining is maybe we can make the argument to governments and other places that, you know what, cannabis is actually not only a public health safety in this way, but it can change other industries as well for
and can I just say,
arguably the better or worse, but for a more safety-minded approach.
And you probably want to open the conversation up to the whole panel shortly, but can I just say to all of you, before we move on to the panel, I mean, I would encourage every single one of you to put your list together, put that information together, put the information together about why amnesty is important, put the information together about why an excise tax is unjust. I have the links on that as to how other jurisdictions in the US don't levy an excise tax on top of a sales tax. But put those pieces of information together, backed by research, and go meet your member of parliament. Because I'll tell you, I would be in the top whatever percentile of members of parliament on the cannabis file in terms of how knowledgeable I am, and I would not be as knowledgeable as many of you in the audience. And so unless you're sitting down in a friendly way and saying, here's the evidence, I'm passionate about it, and here's why, and how can you help me bring these issues to the table with the government or with the leader of your party if the party's not in government? I think that's the way you see change going forward, and you have to inform members of parliament to be advocates on your behalf.
And if I can jump in there, this goes back to that question I was going to bring you, and it's a pretty broad question, but I think it fits in perfectly here. In terms of you're one of the only MPs super engaged in the cannabis profile, I would say, or like you said, high percentage. I would also argue, I know because I used to be his constituent, that you are actively engaged with people. Like you'll get an email back, you're on Twitter. So my more broad question is, what level of engagement, I've since moved and do not get an email back, so what level of engagement should we be expecting from our members of parliament, our city councillors, our government, and what is the most effective way? Is it going in there face to face? Is email okay? Is phone okay? I know that people have ability issues and things like that. So on that very basic level, how can people talk to their representatives?
I don't think it is, the question is often framed in this, how do we talk to representatives, but representatives are just people. So if you think of it, if 10 of us sent you a letter that all said the same thing and it was very clearly copied and pasted and very impersonal, that will have an impact because 10 people sent it to you. If 10 people all sent different emails that were more personal and that told a personal story about why you care and focused on the fact that one's wife has cancer and that's why this is so important, that I'm a patient and I can't drive because of the new regime. I mean, the more that you make it personal to your story, the more impact it will have, as it would for anyone receiving those emails and letters. And the more personal you make it, not just related to you, but the more personal of a connection you establish. We're human beings. The more personal these connections are, the more powerful your advocacy will be. And so if you are sending an email or tagging someone on Twitter, those will have varying levels of effect depending upon how personal the outreach is. Twitter will be less effective than a personal email. A personal email will be more effective than a form email, but an in-person meeting will be more effective. And an in-person meeting where you're not mad, but you are building a bridge that you then reestablish the relationship a year from then with another meeting, and then you reestablish the relationship again with a follow-up meeting. I'll tell you Jonathan as an example, who I met at, I think, a Canadian Students for Sensible Drug Policy event many, many years ago. I mean, there's someone who I have sometimes reached out to him, he has sometimes reached out to me, but there was a relationship established where his advocacy matters a lot more to me because I know him, I trust him, and a bridge has been built than if someone just comes into my office and says, I send you a form email. So, I mean, I don't think I'm any different from any of you. I mean, the more personal the connection is, the more powerful the advocacy.
I didn't
But
know
from
that.
our
That's good to know.
Yeah, and I think from our perspectives, it can be like incredibly intimidating, right? So it is good to know, and I think we as people, that to see them as just people is the perfect reminder. But I do want.
And the more there's a constituent connection, politicians are craven in their own way, and we care about votes. So the more that it's a constituent who lives in our community, and we consider ourselves their representative, and that we're accountable to them, it'll be way more powerful than just an organization reaching out on an issue.
So that is the second part of my question. How accountable should we expect our representatives to be? Should they be responding to an email or phone call? Should they be in office hours to go and visit them? What is the level that what is fair?
To each their own with respect to the way they manage their offices, but I would say if you send an email that is personal and you make a phone call to say I would like to set up a meeting, and you say it's myself and 2 other constituents and we all have a similar concern but we have different perspectives and we'd like to share them with a member of parliament, I think most people are going to meet with that group of constituents. So
I think we should, because I know other people have questions, but I want to bring in the rest of the panel and introduce the rest of the panel because I feel like they might help with a lot of the perspectives. Honestly, like, hold on to those questions because a lot of these people will be able to help answer a lot of questions. So we're going to start on the furthest, I guess, your right. We got Abby Roach. dear friend, and she's the founder of the iconic Hot Box Cafe located in the heart of Kensington Market in Toronto. But Abby wears many hats. Abby is also the founding director of OCCRA, the Ontario Cannabis Consumer and Retail Alliance, and the newly appointed executive chair of NORML Canada. A true industry pioneer, Abby has dedicated her whole life to the freedom of cannabis consumers and the normalization and legalization of cannabis. Beside Abby, we have Akwasi Owusu-Bempah, the Director of Research. He is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Toronto. Trained in the field of criminology, has been doing cannabis-related policy and research work for over 15 years. Along with a passion for social justice, he brings his experience to the campaign for Cannabis Amnesty. Everybody, welcome Akwasi. Beside Akwasi, we have Pharrell Miller. Pharrell is a cannabis legal consultant. She works on specifically the enforcement to compliance and licensing. She is the secretary of NORML. And then we have Gerald Major. Gerald Major is the vice president of CFAMM, a medical cannabis patient, staunch chronic illness advocate, and arthritis warrior. Showing symptoms of inflammation in both knees at age 14, he was diagnosed at 21 with ankylosing spondylitis and psoriatic arthritis, both inflammatory arthritis that ends in fusion in the back and peripheral joints. Gerald's arthritis took him out of work 7 years ago, where he was a senior vice president of operations for Citibank Hedge Fund Services North America. Gerald joined CFAMM in 2016 as he noticed the barriers to medical cannabis access for patients, with cost being a major factor. He eliminated sleeping pills and significantly reduced his opioid prescriptions by way of medical cannabis, but many cannot afford their full dose. Gerald is also the president of Canadian Spondylitis Association, board member and consumer group chair of the Arthritis Alliance of Canada, Best Medicine Coalition board member, and member of Ontario Best Practice Research Initiative Patient Advisory Committee. Please welcome Gerald Major. So the first question we have here is, when it comes to the environmental effects of legalization, how do we lessen the carbon footprint of the legal cannabis industry? Does anybody want to take that on?
I think we could start by looking at the packaging. Obviously in the Cannabis Act, there's certain things that you must abide by. You must have child-proof packaging.
Heavy plastic, right? Like lots and lots of plastic.
Tons of plastic. I mean, I think there's room for improvement, starting with possibly like some recycling program initiative, possibly put forth by a big LP where you send back your empty containers. I mean, we need to start really brainstorming here.
Yeah, I think it's even more than that. The regulations around packaging are too restrictive. They're kind of insane, but there's other factors as well. You have to think about water consumption, power consumption, and then you have to think about the amount of nutrients and fertilizers that are going back into the soil. So there's a lot of farming issues and agricultural issues that I think government hasn't thought about when they license out greenhouses and new farms as well. So I think there's a lot in the act that can be written in terms of environmental impact and how the government can kind of control what comes out of the production facilities as well. Just a heads up.
I want to say that I don't think we should have necessarily specific rules to reduce environmental footprint for cannabis than we do for other growers of whether it's green peppers or whatever the case might be. The fact that we have a price on pollution that is to apply, I think will make sure that producers of anything are going to take that into account and try to find efficiencies and reduce energy use as far as it goes. The only thing, I think the plastic point is good. I do remember getting my shipment from the OCS, which was very late, and thinking, what the fuck is happening? Is it like that's all there is in this big plastic jar? So anyway, yeah, so I think that's a good point.
Anyone want to add anything about carbon footprint?
I can add a bit.
Yeah.
Is this good? Okay. I mean, from this perspective, I'm a patient, and that's what we do at Canadians for Fair Access to Medical Marijuana. We look after patient rights and support and everything. So at any time you're adding these complexities to a medicine, I believe that, I have opioids in my house. My daughter is 8 years old. And I'm responsible, and I take care of that, right? And we're talking about, we're getting into the edible conversation where, we've lived in the pharma industry. I had my infusion yesterday, and that means I sit in 2 hours with an IV drip in my arm, and I see pictures on Facebook all the time of people sending that in, and the anxiety that comes from going to these things, and the reactions that come from it. And in the household of, my daughter calls my medicine smoke medicine, and although I don't want to be smoking it for life, really, I'd rather do capsules and oils. That's what has happened. So anytime we look at restricting this exactly the same as something else by overkill on, and I don't know what this means, but anytime that there's more rules and more thought, it costs more. And that's really my thing from here, is that there's more packaging costs more, the more thought around all these things, the spinning of wheels at places, the changing of rules. It just costs. And we're in an environment where people can't afford their medicine. We know that clearly. We're talking about 26%, and there's also 74% that's hanging out there that they also can't afford through coverage, right? So I'll get into it a little bit more, but my opioid story is probably the one that resonates the most, is that I've had to cut down, and that's probably 80% by now, and I did it reasonably. Your brain becomes dependent on opioids. I didn't realize that. I see top-notch doctors over at Toronto Western and Toronto General that have told me that you can't come down too fast. And so, when you have all these things and you keep putting these more things on top, it's just more and more expense. And I won't be able to afford to become an edible consumer. I just won't be able to. So we really have to think about these rules that get put in place that average everyday people. I was successful in my career, but I can't have I'm on long-term disability. I don't have an unlimited amount of funds to spend on things, but it's not lost on me when I can and people can't. And that's powerful. It's almost more powerful than, not to take away from the people that can't, but it's very powerful that people can see that and recognize that. And I know Crohn's very well, right? So what I can say, and I had my phone out earlier, if anyone has an issue with that, I take notes because I forget. That's part of my mental health condition and my depression and stuff. But you made a statement about government. We all knew that government would probably not do this too well, or they'd have struggles with it. And you got like a little bit of cheer or booze or whatever it is, but the moment you said that you were a cannabis user, you got lots of cheers. And you would think from a group like this that has been kind of, through this, and I feel your pain at the back, and you would think that the crowd would be more booing towards your original statement than welcoming with their, you're part of our community perspective, right? So, that was a powerful moment for me. That's when I started using my phone. You said excluding criminals, so you were talking about the criminal part, and you were saying that excluding them that have been convicted from employment and stuff. You were very strong on that. And that's really beautiful to hear. And the messages, and I know I can tell you the messages because I know you get it. So for anyone else here that doesn't know disease very well, I vouch for this gentleman right here because I know what he goes through. That's part of my disease area. And he is, in the top 3% of government talking about this stuff. And he's, when he gets in there, he's sometimes alone. So, he's doing the best that he can. And the fact that he comes out to these types of things and hears these types of questions he's bringing this stuff back to that. So that's the type. You got a real guy sitting right here. That's I mean, so much I started writing down. So I know people that know you, and I'm very, very happy to meet you.
Brilliant. Now, okay, so actually the next question kind of goes along with something that Jonathan brought up earlier about consumption and driving. So there's a lot of argument around driving and cannabis. What would be a proper testing procedure, and in what cases is medical cannabis acceptable? This is open to the panel. Yeah, please.
Sure. So I've done a little bit of research around this. I think the first thing we need to establish is at what point someone is impaired to drive from cannabis, because that's still like the elephant in the room, or the greatest question. We know between like 0.05 and 0.08 milligrams per 100 milliliters of blood of alcohol, your driving is impaired, but we still don't know exactly at what point individuals' ability to drive is impaired. As noted, I'm a researcher, I'm a criminologist. I come at this as a race and policing scholar. Actually back in 2008, when the laws were changed to mandate that individuals must submit to a test for impairment for drugs as they did for alcohol, that raised a huge red flag for me in terms of issues related to racial profiling. And the way in which the laws are written now, I think, opened the door in a huge way to allow the police into the lives of largely marginalized groups in order to conduct further investigation. So, as far as I'm concerned, impaired driving is a serious concern, whether that be from alcohol or from drugs or from perhaps even sleep deprivation. And we should work to keep people off of the roads when they're impaired, whether that be for recreational or medicinal use. We need to recognize that people who use the substance frequently are less likely to be impaired than people who are newbies. And so medicinal users may be able to have a certain level of this in their, or consume a certain amount and not be impaired to the same extent that, you know, the mom who's just trying cannabis for the first time in 15 years would be impaired. But until we figure out, and we haven't yet, when people are impaired from cannabis, I think we need to be cautious both in terms of what we're doing on the roads as well as how we're criminalizing people for engaging in those behaviors.
That's a great answer. Like, I know cannabis came late to me in my life. Like we started after my wife kicked cancer, so I was already like in my 30s. And when I knew I was too impaired to drive, I didn't drive. You know what I mean? Like, which wasn't the case when I was, 19 and driving home from a bar when I really shouldn't have. You know what I mean? Like, there's when I was too impaired, like I'll use that term absolutely, because there's a difference between being impaired and being medicated, right? Like getting your medication and getting your dose of what you need versus like being, again, impaired. And yeah, like I just didn't. Like it was like, no, I can't do this right now. You know what I mean? It was like that's how I felt, which is different than alcohol.
When I grew up in an era where, Mad Canada was doing a real big push to stop alcohol-impaired driving. So the designated driver on a Friday or Saturday night would just smoke weed instead because they, right? That was what was pretty common. Like we certainly know that wasn't necessarily a wise idea. It's like, turn the music down, I'm too high. I can't see. But that wasn't right? Because, whereas you're not impaired in the same way as you are from alcohol, your judgment's not the same, your motor skills are not the same, and certainly your reaction time's not the same.
And I feel
impaired from cannabis.
I feel like that's the problem with people who are making policy on cannabis who aren't cannabis users. That's why, I think it's really important to ask the people, like the politicians that we're talking to, if they're cannabis users or not.
Not to hog the mic, but we should learn from the work that we've done before. The Ledane Commission in the 1970s actually took an abandoned airport and ran a series of cannabis impaired driving studies. We've been doing this work for decades, right? There's researchers at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health right now that have simulators, and we're moving in the right direction, but we're not there yet.
Just to add on to that, from a regulatory perspective, I would like to see it heading in the direction of, when you purchase cough syrup or Benadryl off the counter at a pharmacy, it says on the back, do not operate heavy machinery. When you've taken too much Benadryl, you're feeling a little bit woozy, you probably shouldn't get behind the vehicle. And then I was in Colorado a few years ago and I was ID'd when I was buying cough syrup. So I just think that it's an interesting dynamic, and it would be nice to see cannabis heading more in that direction where we trust people to make a decision.
And I can't ignore the impairment conversation. I mean, it's really real. It's one of those rules that's there that people will not be able to follow if they're daily users. I mean, I find it kind of ridiculous that NORML Canada has come out and said wait 4 hours when I don't think we really understand if 4 hours is going to be good for everyone. I mean, I think it's clear that we know that you can't put a number, so I find that that's kind of, yeah, I mean, I really don't understand that. I mean, I've been driving, I've been a patient for a long time, and I think opioids, and you would know in this, but opioids say be careful driving. That's what I was looking at when I was getting my opioids. And I found it odd, so at the Canadian Rheumatology Association annual meeting, I interviewed one of the ladies responsible for the most recent position statement that's the most medically focused and most inclusive for patients that was released about three weeks ago. It ended with prescribing guidelines. So I mean, lots of cautions, and they'll still get there. And the research has to get to the people in the meaningful way that the people that actually are prescribing it right now, because that's the people that need to see it. But what I was told in that, and I asked the question specifically around opioids, about where's the research on driving with opioids? And I mean, you would know, and I've never confirmed, but it was told to me that there has been studies on opioids, and it was found that once you got used to it, then you became less of a risk. And I mean, I know what it's like driving around on opioids, and I don't know that that study was accurate. No.
I'll just real quick say, on the question of, there are people who, when they, and I'll use myself as an example, there are lots of times I'm high and I should not drive. There are other people who, and I'm not a daily user, and I don't, you know, I'm more of a recreational user, and I should not be behind a wheel when I consume cannabis. I'll be a worse driver. When it comes to patients who are daily users and either have a higher tolerance and or it has stayed in their system because they're such a heavy user that they haven't even used recently, and so they're definitely not intoxicated whatsoever and under the influence whatsoever and impaired whatsoever. To your point, the science isn't there to allow the law to deal with this in a useful way, except to say that other jurisdictions, as I understand it, allow for a medical defense, and so that you're able to fight this out on the facts in court in a way that the current rules don't, and that's a fight that I lost, but that would have, for me, based on where the science is, made more sense.
All right. Do you want to add anything, Sarah, or?
Any audience questions on that? Here, yeah, let's get a new voice.
Just a quick question on what you've heard as far as arrest or stories around cannabis impaired driving so far. Because I've seen a couple instances, but I'm very confused as to what the stats are, if there are any stats at all.
I don't know any stats. No.
It's early days. I don't know.
Like, well, I think the first person was arrested like literally hours after legalization came around. It was in the first 36 hours for sure. There was a media story about the first impaired arrest. But in terms of the actual stats hopefully this will come from Stats Can relatively soon.
When do those type of stats become available, let's say? Let's say we want to look at cannabis arrests across the board in the first year or so of legalization. When and how do we get that information?
It's a very good question. So there are three places I would look for stats around cannabis. So like Stats Canada's Cannabis Hub, basically. So Statistics Canada is collecting and releasing information periodically. Health Canada is. And then in relation to justice stats, like general justice stats, the Canadian Centre on Justice Statistics, which is a sub-agency of Stats Can, periodically releases arrest and other criminal justice data, and there'll be cannabis-related data in there as well.
All right, the next question is based around like the stigma. So like the word smoke is demonized and the word vapor has been confused with e-cigarettes. How do we encourage safer consumption methods while keeping with public health and safety?
I guess I'll answer that.
Yeah, please.
Okay, so I've been selling paraphernalia for 20 years. I've been allowing people to consume cannabis on my property for the last almost, 16. So this year, as soon as October 17th hit, everything changed. Now we are not allowed to have vaporizers outside of the box. So we have to literally explain to people how to use their safer consumption method by pointing at a cardboard box and making them imagine it. It's really insane, but we're doing it. We're getting around it. We're not allowed to have people vape or consume cannabis on our property. So now we literally have paraplegics outside in winter in wheelchairs, dabbing because they can't dab in their homes, so they have to come to the hot box, and my staff has to wheel them out in minus 40-degree weather and set them up. Thank God for Shatterizer. But and there's people standing outside on the street smoking weed with bongs. It's insane. And I laugh, and my neighbors were like, well, what do we do? And and I was like, well, I guess you call the Attorney General's office and you say, well, I had a vapor lounge in my neighborhood for 16 years. What happened to it? Now there's people smoking weed outside. It's really weird. Why is this, right? So there's a lot of, when we were lobbying for the Smoke-Free Ontario Act, the e-cigarette people came and they were going to lobby with us. And I was like, I don't think it's a good idea because the semantics of the word vapor. So for a non-consumer, when they think about the word vapor, they think of this huge plume of coffee cake flavored plumes of whatever it is, right? And when we're explaining, no, it's cannabis vapor, hardly anything comes out. You won't even know that it's happening. I sat in a bar the other night and I vaped my packs for hours. I was baked. Anyways, nobody even said anything. They didn't even know, right? So it's funny. Anyway, so to me, we really need to keep pushing for the semantics to change. So whether we change the word vaporizer to something, right? But we have to keep pushing the provincial governments because there's this misconception, which is why we go back to the original question before of why is this like this and why is marketing like this? Because everybody is afraid of smoke and nobody wants cannabis to lead to more smokers, right? So we've actually made it more harmful almost to teach people about safer consumption methods by confusing the word vapor with e-cigarettes, by making edibles demonized, right? And by not allowing for consumption spaces. Consumption spaces really, I know I'm jumping ahead, but consumption spaces are a place where people, whether they're people who consume all the time, or whether you haven't smoked a joint since 1969, or whether this is your first time, it's a place where you have educated staff and people in a community that can help you understand and learn how to consume better. In the last 16 years, we were the first vapor lounge to actually use vaporizers, and we have taught hundreds and thousands of people how to properly use your vaporizer. And if you see smoke, it's too much, turn it down, right? And now we have to literally point at a cardboard box and push people out into the street and force them to smoke. It's nutty. To me, so, again, when we go into the marketing and why is the law like this, it's semantics and that's it, right? It's just the fear of word.
See, I don't think most people understand how important the vapor lounges and hot box cafe are to community. You know what I mean? And people learning about how to safely consume their medicine and whatnot. It's incredible. We've thrown parties at hot box, and it's just such a safe space. It's such a vibe that's not a bar. That's where people can sit and discuss ideas instead of getting drunk and grabbing at it. It's just such I feel as soon as here's the next question. Will we ever get very necessary licensed consumption spaces?
Edible lounges. So the dream right now, the provincial dream that I'm hearing is edible lounges. To me, as a person who owns a lounge, literally is like the scariest thing on earth. Like, I can, right now, if you sit in front of me and you take a few pulls off a joint, or you do a dab, or you hit your vaporizer, I can look in your face, and within 3 seconds, I know if you're gonna green out on my floor, or if you're gonna fall over, and my staff is trained. That if something happens to you, they know exactly, they understand how to deal with it. Like, we can have you up and running in no time, right? Everyone is first aid trained, we understand how cannabinoids work, and we can have you up and running, and we can also we can explain to you why this happened, right? With an edible, we literally have to watch you for the next half hour to see whether, or 10 minutes, I guess, if it's a fast-acting drink, but there's still a lag time. So as a staff person, you literally have to watch your customer for a period of time to see if something's going to happen. And to me, that's kind of scary. And there's a whole level of education that's going to happen to probably 85% of my consumers, where we have to educate them about how edibles work, right?
Yeah, because
so,
if you eat one that's too much, like you can't cut them off. You know what I mean? Like if they're smoking, you can be like, whoa, like take it easy on that. But if they ate like an edible that's too strong, there's no like cutting that off.
It's like taking that acid when you're 16. It's like, well, that's the next 10 hours of my life coming up, you know? Yeah, no going back.
Can I say, I don't know the answer to the ideal regulatory system, because obviously people will have different views. I'm sure some people love the idea of an edible cafe and then other people don't. But when it comes to the question of responsible use and how we talk about it, I'll just say from the perspective of the politician, I try my best when I talk about it in public that you said the word consume, I use the word consume. I don't say smoke, I talk about my vaporizer. I don't mention when I was in undergrad and taping, duct taping pop bottles together. I mention the fact that I've got a vaporizer, and that as some people turn to a bottle, a glass of scotch or a glass of wine, I turn to my vaporizer on a Friday night, and make those comparisons as much as possible, because one, it makes sure that those who are skeptical about it think about it in a different way, and they don't think about it as, oh, those teenage kids smoking outside the school, and people have a particular stereotype in their mind oftentimes, and you want to break that down. And the second thing is you want to make sure that people understand it as responsible use, so that in the same way, when people talk about restricting access to young people and tackling organized crime, I've always added, much to the chagrin of Bill Blair, but I always add and treat Canadians like the responsible adults that they are. But if we are to keep that as a principle of legalization, we need to then talk about responsible ways of using this. And so in the same way responsible adults can have a glass of scotch on a Friday night in the comfort of their own home, I can turn to my vaporizer. And so I try as much as possible to both frame it differently in terms of consumption, and not to reiterate stereotypes, and also then to frame it in the context of responsible use.
See, I feel that comparing it to alcohol and having like a glass of scotch at home, that's easy to do because you have a home, right? Like people that are visiting, people that don't own their own property, people that are renting, like they don't have the...
I rent.
Okay,
just so we're clear here, I rent. It's the city of Toronto. So.
But there's just like a lot of people that don't have their own space, or rent a space or whatever. Like there are rental properties that don't allow smoke, that don't allow cannabis smokes, like in particular. So it's just not accessible. But if you wanted to go get that glass of scotch, there's still access anywhere you want to go, any bar that's open. You know what I mean? Like there just isn't a place for you to go and hang out on a Friday night to consume it.
So that gets to your second question about the ideal regulatory framework and provinces catching up and making it more accessible. My point is only in the way that we talk about it. And if the framing, in my view, it shouldn't be, we're talking about smoking. I actually think vaping, we should reclaim that. I think vaporizers, it's good luck getting away. I had an iLight, I now have a PAX, but I think we should, it should be perfectly acceptable to talk about vaping cannabis, and that is the most responsible way, in my view, from a public health perspective of using it. So edibles, I think, when we get there and dosages are regulated properly, will be another avenue. But I think we just have to talk about it in that context more and more and more, and it doesn't have to be a scary thing and reinforcing all the stereotypes.
You just normalize it.
Sorry, to your point about personal space, I'm going to tell you a story. I went with a police officer, a friend of mine, to speak to a city councillor about our lounge and licensing and whatever else not. And, you know, we were talking and Tony was like, my police officer friend, he said, you know what scares me? I was like, what's that, Tony? He said, when I pull someone over for rolling up a joint in their car, you know, and I say, hey, like, why, you shouldn't be driving, right? And they say, well, I'm not allowed to consume in my house, and this is my second private space, right? So by not allowing consumption spaces, we're actually, especially in urban centers, we're really pushing people into just more, to break the law, to make worse decisions. So, you know, let's keep pushing for those consumption spaces to exist.
Talking about like the comparison between cannabis and alcohol, just how that's spoken about more, and the comparison between cannabis and drugs, cannabis and tobacco, whatever. I think it is almost harmful. Realistically, like something like fast food is more harmful than cannabis statistically. Children can go get that. It's not very regulated. So I think even over-the-counter medications is a better connection.
Except that I don't drink as much because I smoke, because I consume cannabis. And so it has other uses, but without question, it has a replacement use for using a recreational substance with one's friends or in the comfort of one's home. You know, when my wife has her glass of wine, and I look at it and I go, nah, I don't want that tonight. So I think, I take your point, but I think I would disagree that I think there is a clear replacement in our society with respect to recreational use of alcohol and recreational use of cannabis.
I think it's harmful to compare those directly, like that being the comparison.
So, again, like, I think if we're thinking about trying to advance discussions about cannabis, like in a sensible manner, we need to recognize that it's a mind-altering substance, right? So that puts it in line with tobacco, with coffee, and I'll put coffee up there too, with coffee, with alcohol, with all other drugs. One of the best examples that I've seen in terms of these comparisons is Professor David Nutt from the United Kingdom, who was on their drug advisory, on the UK's drug advisory panel, and he got kicked off for saying that MDMA was that horseback riding was more dangerous than MDMA. Because when he ran the numbers, more people were harmed from horseback riding in the United Kingdom than they were from MDMA, right? At the end of the day, one's a mind-altering substance, one's a pastime. And so what we can recognize, and some places are actually regulating sugar now, right? Like they're actually regulating sugar in the way that they should because it's harmful to us. But if we want to advance like sensible discussions about these things, we need to recognize what it is. And it is, as well as being a medicine, right? It's a mind-altering drug.
But like, I do agree, like it's different than all of those things. Like it is comparable to a glass of scotch, but it's also like my wife's cancer medicine. It's my depression medicine. It's, you know, it's different things to everybody else. And I see exactly where you're coming from because it's not alcohol. It's not opioids. It's not any of these things. But somebody that's never used cannabis, it's what you're going to compare it to. You know what I mean? Like it's...
And not just that, crass politics is someone who wants more people to support legalization. The vast majority of Canadians consume alcohol and know it to be something that they can control and that they can consume without a problem, despite all the problems with it, that they understand it to be something that they can consume in the comfort of their own home, whether it's a rental or not, as something to relax and for recreational purposes. And so, obviously, alcohol is more harmful, without question. But drawing that connection for the purposes of explaining to people who have no idea and are really worried this is this super harmful substance and what are we doing allowing it to be legal, that sets a frame for them. And then you can move on to say, oh, by the way, it's less harmful, sure. But I think that is a very useful frame for people where they understand this is a substance that they can control and use responsibly, and cannabis is the same, but even less harmful.
And to continue on that point and the edible conversation, that's why edibles are sort of the end-all and be-all of you know, people who don't consume because they don't really understand. They can relate to food, they can relate to drink, they can't relate to smoke, right? So it's again, it goes back to semantics.
Ian, we have a couple more audience questions. Can we jump in there with
Yeah.
Can I finish that one off?
Oh, absolutely.
No,
Yes,
sorry.
yes.
Gerald,
Is specific to this, they have questions, or they want to change the subject?
Specific to this.
Okay, go.
We're both with CFAMM, so I mean, as long as one of us is talking, it's fine.
So everyone, this is Max, and he's from CFAMM, and he's a volunteer, and we can't go through the night without recognizing James O'Hara for what he's done for CFAMM. Here's a guy battling illness right now, right, that needs lots of support, so, and he's here in this snowstorm. So I think we all have to recognize that for sure. I think that was Max's way of getting himself introduced. So when you look at, this is like a whole advocacy story, right? Because, I mean, he wrote my bio, but it's true. There's 5 different organizations, and I spend more time on the pharma type model that's been created over years. Advocacy works, right? I was faced with what they were going to do in condos, and I live in a condo because of my arthritis. Because I can't shovel and I can't clean the driveway, but more importantly, mentally, I don't want to have the burden of thinking about that, and who's doing it instead. So, I mean, with the help of Jonathan and stuff back in the day, I ended up in media in this, and it was coming down to basically I would have to move, right? And because of the people I know and the stuff, I would then want to take action on this. And my board is, I mean, I'm such an advocate, and I can't even get my gym open earlier than 7 o'clock, and this is 4 years. And anyone that knows about ankylosing spondylitis is that there's sleep issues. So when my back starts aching, I'm up, and that's 5:30, and most gyms should be open at 5:30. That's my best medicine. So instead I take opioids, and then I go back to sleep, and I end up groggy, right? So you get into that. But, I mean, the comparison conversation really is, in advocacy, really, like, you're not trying to change your own mind, right? You're trying to have discussions and further the conversation on this. So you have to make it relatable to the audience, right? So, I mean, if you're talking and comparing it to alcohol, it's because at the time that interaction that's maybe the only way that that person can understand it, right? So there's certainly ways to do it, but in those individual conversations, those are real, right? So the comparisons come up through conversation because of, I relate it to more things that they understand so that they can actually get the connection. And then this is really kind of the whole conversation around advocacy, right? So I'm fortunate in the way that I was, you know, I have a business background, and I've done quite a lot of things, but the advocacy space can't afford people like me, right? If I was working and taking a check, and so then you get challenges with government on funding patient organizations, and then you have the transparency conversation right now that's kind of limiting the funds that you would get, and then, I mean, I run organizations, and the last person really that I want to reach out to for funding is the people that I'm trying to help. They're the most vulnerable, and they need the most help, and I don't want to be taking from them. So this is kind of from a Canadians for Fair Access to Medical Marijuana thing and the Don't Tax Medicine campaign. I mean, we're going out purposefully and trying to actually create social change, which is much needed here, social responsibility, and we're hoping that we're going to get some really big momentum for it, but it's, I mean, as much as it's a CFAMM thing, it's a patient advocacy thing. Patient advocacy groups need more funding. They need to be able to service their community, because those are the communities that want it. Like, patient advocacy groups really need more support than corporate. But you can't compete there. You lose people, the good people, because they go for high-paying jobs, and that's what we've created. So I hope everyone gets behind the messaging of Don't Tax Medicine, is that, this is really a much bigger thing, and it's stuff that is really broken on the other side, and we have a real opportunity to fix that here. But that saying of "you're never alone," that patient groups, and I use a lot, and when I say you're never alone, that means because you can call me anytime, and I'll call you, and we'll check, and I'll spend time on the phone. James, right? Are you alone? But how does everyone get the types of support that James getting by loving family and caregivers around them? And that's what we're trying to change here with the funding ask and the call on other groups to, you know, follow the lead of other organizations that really, really get it. If you're in the medical space and you're profiting from cannabis use, then you should be socially responsible to support it.
Good. That brings us to the next question, which is what's being done, what can be done to ensure medical cannabis patients have adequate access to affordable medicinal cannabis in light of the legal rec market?
I'll kick this one off on behalf of Jack because he couldn't make it today. He's working on a constitutional challenge right now, which hopefully will allow some sort of retail framework for medical patients, right? Or some sort of storefront access. Because we've gone from growing their own medicine to having to buy from an LP to in-term supply provisions, which is being able to grow and buy from an LP. And I think the next step naturally would be to be able to walk into a store in the same way as any recreational user and purchase your cannabis as a medical patient.
Can I just jump in on the no taxing campaign? Fully behind it. I had met with folks from the Prime Minister's office and the Finance Minister's office to argue for why we should not be taxing medicinal cannabis. But this is this is the comparison that we drew up and we sent. Oregon's got no tax on medicinal cannabis, a 17% state tax and 3% optional local municipal tax on rec. Colorado's got 2.9% state tax on medical, an excise tax of 10% on top of that for rec. Washington has a 37% excise tax on medical, but they have an additional 8% sales tax, state tax on rec that is not on medical. So even there, they don't tax it exactly the same, even though it's incredibly high. California, no medical tax. Nevada, 2% excise tax on medical and a 10% excise tax on rec. So we are literally the only jurisdiction in North America, at the very least, to tax medicinal and rec the same, and it makes no sense at all.
Really?
Are we going to let Max
Yeah,
ask a question?
It's actually still relevant. As much as I do like an introduction, I do have a question. So this comes back to the larger argument that I think is the challenge with recreational legalization for patients is, increasingly they're being conflated with a recreational user, even though a medical healthcare professional needs to be involved in that process, and it's meant to be for medical purposes. So with things like edibles as well, you've got a 15% potency variation for some product, which is not reasonable for someone who needs to dose with it. So why are they being regulated in the same way? So my question is, in addition to tax, which is a very big challenge and one of the main parts of access, and so we appreciate your support in that, what are other ways, aside from having separate regulations, which would be ideal, that you try to at least fight for patients as a unique population within the cannabis user market?
So the only other advocacy point was this idea of home grow. I actually think, and I argued that there should be separate limits and a separate regime for growing for patients, regardless of the rec regime. I do think home grow is important as far as, so if it's not ideal because of, if I were a patient and a heavy user, I would certainly want access to edibles of a certain potency, oils of a certain potency, and growing is not the perfect solution necessarily, but it is a good solution if it means free, albeit not perfect. If you've got solutions in terms of how the medical market should be regulated differently and where you think there is a sensible push that I can make, please let me know. I'd be happy to make that push. The only other thing I'll say, the difficulty, and we can talk about taxes and we can talk about other regimes, the difficulty is that they do have a separate regime for patients, and it requires a drug identification number. And this is where I lost the fight, is there is, to my understanding, maybe there's more than one now, but when I was fighting about it, there was one called Sativex, whereas a cannabis derivative that does have a drug identification number, and then you don't pay tax on it. And it is subject to a separate regime. And so on the front end, there are healthcare professionals who are saying these people are in need, and on the other end, there have been clinical trials to establish that this drug can fulfill the needs of those patients. And so the problem is, of course, that there's not a ton of money that is in the space to say, oh, we can profit off of the medicinal market so much that it's worth putting the money into these clinical trials. And so my view is the interim solution should be no tax, and we should be investing to make sure there is the sufficient research so that there are the clinical trials necessary for the existing health system to operate as it does operate and to provide drug identification numbers. But that is the separate system right now. It's just it's woefully undersupplied if there's only one drug in the system.
Jill, did you want to finish that up? I saw you scribbling while he was...
No, I scribble because I forget, right?
Yeah,
So,
no, cool.
No, I'm good. Thank you.
So on to the criminality, so maybe Akwasi, if you can jump in. What steps should the government take and is taking towards cannabis amnesty?
Not nearly enough, as far as I'm concerned, as a researcher, and Cannabis Amnesty is concerned. So at Cannabis Amnesty, what we're advocating for and lobbying for is for the government to erase the criminal records of individuals who've been convicted of cannabis-related crimes that are no longer illegal. This seems to make sense. We've heard, some of why that makes sense before, so that people have, equal access to job opportunities, finishing their education, housing, volunteering, traveling, and things like that. What the government has done is indicated that they will allow for record suspensions for people who've served their sentence. So we have a pardon system rather than what we're arguing for, which is expungement. And let me get both philosophical and practical here and explain the differences. So we don't have pardons, we have record suspensions. What that means is that once you serve your sentence, the government's going to waive the $641 or $37 fee. You'll be able to apply, and if you receive one of these record suspensions, basically your criminal record for the cannabis-related offense is set aside, but it stays there, okay? It shouldn't be able to be accessed by most employers, and if they can, it says that you've been basically excused for what you've done. So philosophically, the government's basically excusing you for your bad behavior. Practically, the record still stays intact. If another government comes in afterwards and decides that legalization was a bad idea and they want to reverse everything, those criminal records can be reinstated. If you're deemed to be of not in good character, it can be reinstated. And if you commit another criminal offense, it can be reinstated. Expungement, on the other hand, would be a complete erasure of that criminal record. It would be the government acknowledging that it was wrong to criminalize a behavior in the first place, and it, philosophically and practically, as I said, clearing that. And we have precedent for that. Bill, is it C-41 or C-61 in related to crimes of, let's talk to the lawyer. Is it 41 or 61? In related to crimes related to homosexuality. So the government's just provided expungement for people who were convicted of same-sex related crimes related to same-sex behaviors. Acknowledging that was, to criminalize those activities was what they called a profound historic injustice, okay? We at Cannabis Amnesty believe that the same things happened here. I can get into a little more detail as to why, but our drug laws have been historically racist and enforced in a very racist and classist manner. Bill Blair has acknowledged this, Justin Trudeau has acknowledged this. Unfortunately, Ralph Goodale has not gone far enough in accepting this history. I think perhaps because he's somewhat ignorant to that reality. And so expungement has not been forthcoming. Now there's more that I want to discuss a little more in terms of the things that we can do actually to repair some of those harms, but I want to open it up first and I'll come back to some of my further thoughts.
I think they haven't, because admitting, expungement would be an apology, essentially, right? And I think they're not quite there yet to apologize for the war on drugs. You know what I mean? I think in the next 30 years, maybe, we'll get that, 50 years, but right now, they're not there yet.
So, but I'm not going to defend the government's position because I've actually seconded an NDP colleague's bill to expunge the records. But the government, when I fight this, they say this is to address historical injustices, and I will throw back at them, well, hang on, there's a lot of data to show that there's been a historical injustice here, and they will say, but it's not every single person. This is, don't boo me because I'm just going to give you their argument. Every single person who is discriminated against for being LGBTQ, that was an injustice, full stop, in the government's view. And so a full-scale apology is necessary. There may have been an unequal application of this law, but the law, in their view, was not unjust on its face, only in its application, and therefore the same level of apology doesn't make sense to them. So
Which is where they
destroy that argument for me.
Yeah, well, which is where the history lesson is important. So our drug laws have always been racialized. Our first drug law was actually the prohibition of alcohol, which specifically targeted our indigenous populations. It was the first drug that was outlawed. Second was the Opium Act. The use of opium was heavily tied to the Chinese population after the completion of the railroad. Although it was widely used across different groups, that specific population was targeted for. They were the primary target of those offenses. Cannabis, 1927, Emily Murphy's Black Candle and the Black and the Asian Menace, and it was all rhetoric around racialized bodies and their use of a specific substance. In the United States, it was Mexicans, of course, is why it's called marijuana. So the laws were developed with this racialized thinking in mind, and they were enforced in such a manner. Now, one of the most interesting things, and part of the reason that the government can claim an ignorance, is that we don't actually have much in the way of race-based criminal justice data in Canada. So although we have, cannabis arrest statistics, police agencies aren't mandated to send that to Statistics Canada with racial descriptors. Actually, many police agencies strip the race descriptors from the data before they send it to StatsCan. So, whereas you talked about the Vice piece, it's sad to say, I'm proud, but sad to say that I've been involved in almost every piece of research on race and cannabis that's taken place in this country in the last decade and a half. That's because there's been so little. And the work that has been done was first by Jim Rankin at the Toronto Star, and he looked at Toronto and we saw that black and brown bodies were more likely to be arrested, and then Rachel Brown in Vice News. And so we're in this situation where I have the federal government calling me, asking me for access to the race-based arrest data when it's them that should have it, right? So they can say, oh, well, no, this hasn't on its face. Sure, it might be equal to all, but Justin Trudeau admitted to smoking while sitting as an MP. He admitted that his brother was caught with cannabis after a car accident, and his father used his political and legal connections to get his brother out of that charge. That opportunity is not open to all Canadians, and that's why it's unjust.
So they ask you for the data, but they don't listen to you when it comes to
it's so ironic that, and it's not just federal, provincial as well. I get calls asking me for this data. It's like I have to file access to, freedom of information requests usually, because it's at the provincial level, for this data, right? I have to enter into these quasi-legal battles with these government agencies to get the data. They fight tooth and nail not to give it to us, and then they ask for it back.
Can I, just one last thing on this topic, we can continue the conversation, but there are lots of touch points for advocacy going forward, and I know NORML's probably drawn up a list of things to advocate for, and I know CFAMM's got their list, but in the short term, I can't think of a more important issue where the fight is we're still in the arena. The decision has not been, the government has said that they want to proceed with pardons, and they're very reticent to proceed by way of expungements. But I don't see this as a closed door at the moment, and so this is something that I think people have to be really vocal about.
And I'm going to use that just as a completely unshamed plug for Cannabis Amnesty. We're right now gearing up for the next election. This is absolutely not a closed or a finished fight, and so we are going to continue to advocate for expungement. We want to see this through into this election. I will say as another plug, if you want to become more familiar with this, I recently gave a TEDx talk called The Untapped Promise of Cannabis Legalization, where in 13 minutes and 10 seconds, I lay out the 15 years of work that I've done and the decades that's been done in the United States, and then synthesize it in a way that's completely understandable and translatable so that you can do as noted and have nice informed conversations with your local MP and MPPs.
Brilliant. This is great discussions up here. I want to touch on something that's really hip to talk about these days. CBD. CBD is as harmful as over-the-counter Tums. but it is treated as a controlled substance. What steps can be taken to ease the policies surrounding this amazing non-psychoactive compound so people can have easy access? Now, there's a follow-up question, but I'll bring that up after.
Based on what I know, and I'm not an expert in this as far as it goes, but based on, I have received emails about this from constituents and did some due diligence, and it doesn't make sense to me that we are classifying it the way we classify it, and this is something that I think Health Canada will change once they've got an established basis for doing so. And they've done their due diligence on their end. They're a slow-moving organization, and they want to make sure they've got sufficient evidence. I was just fighting, constant fights to push for faster action on phasing out and banning a number of substances that other jurisdictions have banned based on evidence as far as it goes. So it's not the fastest-moving organization, but on this, I see this as something that will change. A question of whether pushing for this will see faster change, I don't know, but it makes sense to me that it ought to change based on what I've read.
I think it's a bit overkill to require like a cannabis drug license and these things for just CBD, like a non-psychoactive component, right? Minimal harms. And I would like to see regulated, whereas like a natural health product and being able to go into different like health supplements, protein powders, these sorts of things. So that's something. Yeah. So.
They want to money for themselves. That's pretty much the basis of it all. No one's saying it.
I don't think it's about money. I think it's about a lack of understanding
Yeah.
right? We've been selling hemp products for 20 years with CBD in them. It's all, I hate to say it again, it's all semantics. There's, I think eventually you'll see cannabis in general. I always tell people, cannabis is going to be like corn, where the amount of corn on the cob that we actually eat is very minimal, but the amount of corn syrup and corn starch and corn derivatives that we use on a daily basis are humongous, right? And I think CBD is one of those compounds that we're already seeing. You go to Sephora and they have a sativa makeup area, right? And it's so CBD is slowly making its way, and I think once the World Health Organization just declassified it, I think once the guard starts to drop and Health Canada does due diligence, I think we'll be able to see CBD products over the counter. I know Shoppers Drug Mart, one of their big plays is derivative products and I think CBD is a big part of the play for pharmaceuticals. I know it is in my line of products that we're designing, definitely.
Because you can get like CBD from not just cannabis, right? Like you can get CBD from hops. So as it's regulated, like what if I make extract the CBD from hops and then sell that? Where does that sit? You know what I mean? Like it's not cannabis derived, but it's still heavily, considered a narcotic. Is there any plans to change that in the government in any shape, way, or form? Or recognize it?
I pull up the answers I got from the health ministry when we were bugging them about this, but I understood from their response that this is one of those, and you get these responses not just on this. There's another, people know BPA and the dangers of BPA, and I just got a number of emails about BPA and receipts and how the EU's phasing out by 2020, and Health Canada's, it's under review at Health Canada as to whether they phase out BPA and receipts, and I would put this in the same category of under review, and so I expect that they will land on the right answer where the evidence is. It's just a matter of going through the process and them taking their time, being comfortable where things should be, and we just got a food guide after many years of advocacy and evidence at Health Canada. They're still consulting on front of package labeling. Like these things move very slowly in my experience.
CBD?
CBD.
Yeah. So we have autoimmune conditions and inflammation's our issue, and that's CBD is supposed to be repairing your immune system, and I take drugs to shut it down. But so my issue and a lot of patients that I speak to, their issue is that it's just the amounts that they may need is just unaffordable, simply unaffordable, right? I've tinkered around with it and I can't sustain it. So, I mean, something probably the best compound for me would be CBD. And I mean, so consider me a massive underdoser of CBD. I mean, we're having issues bringing it into the country, although it's okay to come in, and then there's bottlenecks there, and there's staffing issues in Health Canada. So the very thing that, you know, I'm waiting for, I recognize all these barriers to it. So I mean, I just stopped taking it because the little amount that I take, it's just throwing money away. And if I'm a user that should be, just as a comparison, if I'm a user that should be around 600 to 800 milligrams a day of CBD, and or full spectrum oral, like full plant, but predominantly CBD, my ratio, I mean, the amount of edibles that I could probably tolerate from a THC perspective is maybe 50 before I get pasty, and I just don't like the experience, right? So when you have that and you're growing it in Canada and you're trying to make products and you need 10 times the amount of it, then just cost and affordability is the issue. And that's where we need to, I mean, this is why we do a big push on pharmacy inclusion of medical cannabis, because we don't only advocate for the people that are members and consumers now. We have to think about the people like my mother that is finally getting there. I watch stigma change in my family very well. Like, I know there's 3 or 4 different groups of people that I'm like, okay, I wonder how long it's going to take for them. And I found that, you know, the endocannabinoid system is an undeniable fact, scientific fact that exists, and that's a link. But it's CBD that is changing stigma pretty quick, because people know they're wrong, but they don't like to admit that they're wrong. This gives them an out. Oh, I didn't know about that, and then they're in there. So then, I mean, I can't wait for the day where we start to see a lot of CBD. I mean, yes, there's cases for it for supplements and nutritional values and stuff like that, but then we still have to think of the power of this medicine for patients and disease. And we can't be into a still cost factor, right? So we can't, for me, we gotta be really careful with CBD that it stays considered a medicine for the patients. And then also it will end up everywhere because it's fantastic.
That's all the questions I have for the panel. Is there any questions out here that the crowd has? Yeah. Oh.
Hi, my name is John, and I'm a medical grower. I've been for years, and I don't understand why, if I have to move my medicine from where I grow it to where I live it, I'm restricted to only do it at 150 grams at a time. I'm terrified to move something. I take large amounts, and I just think it's putting me in a position where I could be in trouble. And you're talking about other people having things at Sponge. I'm just worried about moving something from A to B, and still, you know, I'm not going to jail for this. I think I've been made to feel really nervous about this whole driving thing, and I don't even drive. So I don't think it's right that all these big companies can move tons and tons of it, and I have to be fucking stressed out over moving my medicine from A to B. I think it's disgusting, and I just think it's disgusting. So, I don't know. I'm pissed off about that. And I hear all this other stuff, but it's like, you're asking about how to market it. You don't even know how to grow the goddamn stuff or sell it yet. So it's like you put the horse before the cart. It's like we're giving out driver's licenses, and we don't even have any goddamn streets in the country. And if you're wondering if the LPs are full of black market people, yes, they are. Read the news and watch for what's coming out.
There are a few other questions. There's 2 over here.
And before the next question, just so you know, you can actually transport your full storage allotment from your storage site to your home use site. Call Health Canada, they'll confirm that with you. You have to take your Health Canada MCR document with it in the transport process. Okay. But you can absolutely, if you have an AG, or if you're growing for yourself at a remote site, can move your full storage allotment at any one time.
Okay, thank you.
It's interesting. I still, claps to your point, and I love your passion, and thank you so much for speaking your story like that. It really means a lot. And I think the bigger point there is that these legislations aren't as accessible as maybe the government likes to think that they are. And I mean, I saw a conversation on Twitter where it was, I think it was the Toronto police, but people were asking like, well, what is the legalities of keeping it in my car, for example? If it's in a Ziploc bag in my dashboard, and they said the best practice is to keep it in your trunk, which I don't think is like the actual legal answer either. So if the cops can't communicate with people what the laws are, I do think that, you know, there is some struggles. I saw a question over here.
So I got two questions. So the first being raids and what your perspective on it has been since Project Claudia. I'm wondering how much money and time and effort has been spent towards this direction while other people are being kidnapped or murdered or all the other civil issues that are happening at the same time. And second, just what, in terms of speaking about CBD and more specifically hemp, what you see the future being for hemp, because I feel like that's a huge part of the pie that's not being talked about in terms of its potential and how it relates back to everything, including the environment, including the bioplastics that could be used from it to help alleviate that issue and all the other things that come from it. I feel like it needs to be acknowledged more.
Absolutely. I feel like for Indigenous people, like specifically, we got a huge opportunity right now where like the medicine, yeah, that's one thing, but like, you know, housing is a huge problem on our communities where we can use like the fibrous material after, you know, selling the medicine, we can use the fibrous material to make hempcrete. And you grow that in 6 months as opposed to growing lumber. You know what I mean? And it's breathable and there's no mold and there's just, I see huge opportunities, especially for my community in using this plant and not just for the medicinal part.
I'll just quickly say on the raids, which is at no point has using law enforcement for, at no point using the criminal law for enforcing rules against cannabis been a helpful exercise. That example is a good one, as any example might be a good one. We had a raid next door to my constituency office where you had like, you know, 18-year-olds or 20-year-olds, and the cops were like, we don't want to be doing this. And so that's obviously a waste of resources at the police level, a waste of resources at the judicial level, and obviously negative affecting people's lives seriously for no good reason. As we were about to move to legalization or in the process of moving to legalization, I thought decriminalizing in the interim would have made a lot of sense for that reason and voted to do so, but didn't pass. The only thing I'll say is I think a number of vendors did the movement no favors by moving into communities without getting buy-in from those communities. So we can talk about Hotbox Cafe and community building, but a number of stores in my neighborhood pissed off the neighborhood in a significant way, and then I heard about it, and they were like, "Really, you're legalizing after these assholes moved in?" It was just, it did no one in. So I think it was incredibly wasteful to do what they did in terms of cracking down, but clearly moving into the gray market the way that a number of people aggressively did was unhelpful and needed to be stopped as well.
I guess my 2 cents. You know, legalization will only work if we entice people to enter the legal framework to produce, to sell, and to purchase. And right now, Ontario specific, the purchasing of cannabis is like the legal cannabis is not enticing to anybody, right? The system is failing miserably. The lottery of 25 stores, meh, right? And then all the gray market sellers that closed down in hopes of going legal are now saying, well, what was the point of that? And they're back at it, right? So without proper access and without a way for people to enter a legal framework, legalization will be a failure, and nobody wants that. We all want it to succeed, and I think the government, federal, provincial and municipal, all have to push and understand that we need to be inclusive of people and not exclusive, right? We need to be inclusive of and understand the consumer needs and not be afraid of being open to the concept. And a part of our mandate as NORML, obviously, is to create laws that work for consumers, for industry, and for the general public, because you got to remember that 75% of Canadians don't consume, never will, don't care for it. It makes no difference in their lives whatsoever. So we need to create laws that function for them as well. The raids were a complete waste of time. And when I did a deputation for in Queen's Park one time, they asked me, well, what do you think will work? I said, well, it worked pretty good when you said you're going to be able to get a license if you stop now. That worked pretty good. I saw lots of people close up and put up signs. So if you give us an opportunity to be included, that's what's going to work. And that's where you'll convert the consumer and the illicit market. On the hemp front, hemp is amazing. We've been trying to sell hemp products for many years. All of a sudden, it's become sexy. That's great. Let's keep hemp sexy and keep buying it. All right?
Thank you. Yeah. So it's just the gentleman over there. Thanks for your comments. So when you look at that, right? I mean, he mentioned anxiety, and for those of you that don't understand mental health and anxiety and depression and stuff like that, it means like exactly kind of what he's detailed. Where here's a medicine where we actually have to navigate as patients, and we have to figure out rulings, right? He's anxious over driving, and he doesn't drive. What does that tell you about mental health, right? So, you know, on the pharma land, you get a prescription, you go to the drugstore, and everything's taken care of. Here, I mean, you've got to figure out legislation, you've got to figure out, I mean, really, you should have to, because then you're stressing out over moving stuff around where you're actually able to do so. So that was beautiful, by the way. That's the magic in these types of forums. Let's see. So, yeah, I mean, so we talk about the, having to advocate for issues like tax and issues like